World Regions Geography, Sub-Saharan Africa, Part 6, Demography and Urbanization Continued, Health Concerns. We're talking about HIV, AIDS. Highest rates are in Southern and Eastern Africa, this region down in through here. Women are more affected than men. I mean, typically in this country, in the West, you think of it as being a gay disease or a drug user disease. But in Africa, it's primarily women, and it's because often men are migrant laborers and they will visit prostitutes in this region and spread the disease amongst numerous women. Role of poverty. They're poor women. They may be working as prostitutes. They may have a husband who's a traveling um, laborer who contracts the disease in another region and then brings it home. One of the sad aspects of HIV/AIDS in Africa is you have this decimation of what would typically be your wage earners, your most productive people in your society. And this has done a lot to stall development in Africa and to keep Africa in poverty because of the large percent of the population that has AIDS. As you see, where it starts here in 1990, you see this distribution, heavy here, right there, right there, right there. Interestingly, no data in these regions. My guess is this Congo area is pretty heavily impacted because on three sides it's heavily impacted. Now you see 1999 even more so, with only a few areas still being below, but these areas were almost non-existent, now are heavily impacted. And then by 2012, all of this region heavily impacted. Interestingly enough, if you look here, that's Mali, I believe, right there, it's actually, the rate has dropped. But for the most part, and right in here, it's dropped a little bit. But for the most part, it's pretty heavy and pretty solid. So it's hard to think that this region may not have a really high percent. And that's Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. So I suspect it probably has a very high percent of um, population with AIDS. You look down here in South Africa in particular, extremely high. It has gone from this to this in a period of, what is that, 20 years, 22 years. Low health care budgets and an unwillingness to use contraceptive methods, particularly things like condoms. African cities, rural to urban migration. And what that means is people move from the countryside to the cities. Nearly 40% of the entire population lives in urban areas. And by urban bias, what we're talking about is money spent to improve development, improve education, improve industry, create jobs. There's a strong urban bias in that. Most of the money is spent in urban areas, much like what happens in our country. African diaspora. Now, the diaspora is what it just means is people moving from one area to another, but when they get to the other, they sort of hold their community together, culturally, racially, linguistically, various ways. In this country, part of the African diaspora is a legacy of slavery. People were taken forcibly, shipped to the Middle East, shipped to South America, shipped to the United States, shipped to the Caribbean region, anywhere they needed labor. They were exported from Africa, and that's that legacy of slavery. Post-colonial African diaspora is what you see going on in Europe, with large African communities, and they're located in cities in Europe, and typically form communities based around their tribal or language origins in Africa. A brain drain is a little different than your typical diaspora, but when you have highly educated people, doctors, lawyers, nurses, dentists, even though there is a dramatic need for them in Africa, they often are fleeing to the US or to Europe so that they can have a better lifestyle for their family, a safer environment to raise their family. They can make a lot of money, whereas they can't necessarily do that in Africa. Migration within Africa typically is to search for employment, so it's employment-based migration. And the other major reason is people fleeing conflict areas, whether it's areas controlled by radical Islamists, or if it's simply areas where there's ethnic conflict taking place, civil war, whatever the case is, they're fleeing those areas. But the majority of it is right here for employment. So they're going to South Africa for mining jobs or agricultural jobs. They're looking for work and they're traveling. Refugees and international displaced persons, there's 15.1 million in the region, which is a fairly high percent of the population. That's a substantial number of people that essentially have no means of support, no means of getting food. And so these become regions where you have political unrest, you have radicalization. There are easy targets for radicalization because they have nothing to lose. Future geographies, sustaining representative and effective government. So in order to sustain representative and effective government, which is difficult in Africa, where you have a culture of kleptocracy, which is those in government power steal everything they can get their hands on. And part of this is due to the lack of transparency. Part of it is emerged from the post-colonial fallout. There are a lot of reasons why it's difficult to have representative and effective government in Africa. Economic opportunities. One of the primary goals and one of the primary needs of Africa is to ensure food security. In other words, make sure people have enough to eat, that they can grow their own food, they have enough to eat. Most African countries, particularly in this region, down here, exceptions maybe South Africa and Nigeria, debt is a serious problem. Many of these countries are burdened with excessive debt that they can never pay. And basically the only thing that can happen is that that the G8, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank have programs to forgive African debt in order to give these countries an opportunity to be economically sustainable. And fostering a middle class. When you have 60% of your population only earning 20% of the income, you're not going to have a strong middle class. And a lack of a strong middle class makes it difficult to sustain a democracy. Food, water, and health and energy for all. Very important. There are a lot of projects going on at various nonprofits that try to provide food and water, clean drinking water, water that's not full of disease and various critters that transmit diseases, is difficult to find in Africa and is a severe problem. And there are a lot of nonprofits that their goal is simply to provide a village with enough pure drinking water, proper sewage disposal. I've been in places where the sewage runs down the middle of the village. Not very appetizing, but they're also getting the drinking water from someplace at the end of that. Not very healthy, which promotes diseases and continues to cause problems. It's kind of a revolving door. And that's the end of the chapter.